Greetings ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jerem Adrian and I welcome you back to the channel. It's that time again and here is another new player review, my top 10 reasons to check out Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Over the past month or so, I've been leveling up a character on Final Fantasy XIV and have been streaming my adventures in a playlist that you can watch, links above and in the description box below. I want to stress that my review is from the point of a new player checking out the base game, A Realm Reborn, without doing the Heavensward expansion and capping at level 50. And before I begin my new player review, here is a quick shout out to a bunch of awesome folks who've been joining me during my live streams, providing company, helpful tips, and support in chat. A big thank you to Fido Montoya, Jay Fairclough, Brian, Kiwin, Rico Jez, Ezra Woods, Balthius, Wee Heavy, Arlim JH, Sean, Lee Telfer, and a bunch more. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys hanging out during the streams, and this one's for y'all. So let's talk about Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. This MMORPG didn't have the best of starts, and in its first iteration that was released way back in 2010, the game struggled with a host of problems that led it to be shut down and rebuilt from the ground up. As a result of that, today we have Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, and this 4-year-old MMO is in a better place with a decent player base and stable stream of content coming out too. The Stormblood expansion is the second expansion and it's coming out in less than a week. Thus, I jumped in last month to see what this MMO is all about. As a disclaimer, I am not a Final Fantasy hardcore fan. I simply want to see if there are solid reasons why players who have not played Final Fantasy XIV before should check out the base game. So here are my top 10 reasons to check out Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Number 10. Multiplatform. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn is available for the PC, Mac, and PlayStation currently, and as I've said many times previously, I think it's great that MMORPGs such as this are on consoles too. For those that want a console experience on your computers, there is an inbuilt controller support option, and it's really decent if you'd rather use that and ditch the mouse and keyboard. In the future, however, game director Yoshida did confirm that Square Enix is in talks with both Microsoft and Nintendo about bringing the MMORPG to both the Xbox One and Nintendo Switch. So if all goes well, the game could be on more consoles for more audiences, which can only be a good thing for the game. Number 9. Combat System. One of the first things you'll notice as a new player in Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn is the style and pace of the game's combat system. It's a little different from traditional MMOs, but not in a bad way. In the early levels, your character starts off with only a handful of skills tied to your chosen class, most on global cooldowns, and they do and will feel a little slow in execution. But this is intended and does get so much better as your character grows in level. Majority of the combat skills you acquire with your class will end up being used for combos with skills that you gain later on. And because of how the class and job system works, which we'll be talking about later, combat is made a lot more interesting thanks to cross-class skills and specialized job skills. The combat uses a tap target system, and on top of cooldowns, you'll have to watch your 3 main combat bars, which are HP, MP for magic classes, and TP for melee classes. Combat mechanics will differ from class to class, and I leveled up a Lancer for this review and had to juggle combo attacks, flanking, and TP management in order to be effective in dungeons. But overall, combat became easygoing without a lot of micromanagement at later levels, which I found enjoyable to play. Depending on what class you play, the experience could be different, so do take that into consideration. On that note, the upcoming Stormblood expansion could change the way skills and combat operates for classes affected by any incoming changes, so keep that in mind as well. Number 8. Class, Jobs, and Profession System. One of the things that's pretty unique to Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn is its class, jobs, and profession system. To understand it all, you have to understand the categories they fit into, or it can become pretty confusing for the new player. So there are 4 disciples in the game. There's Disciple of War, which is the use of physical weapons for combat, Disciple of Magic, which is self-explanatory, then there's Disciples of Land, which are the gathering classes needed for crafting, and finally there's Disciples of Hand, which are the crafting classes. Each disciple will have classes tied to that category. For example, Lancers, Archers, and Marauders belong to the Disciples of War. You can level each class up to the level cap, but unlike other MMOs, a single character can level up as many classes on that one character once you hit level 10. You can then change your class on the fly by equipping a weapon or tool if you are a crafter or gatherer. For example, with my bow equipped, I am an archer, but as soon as I equip my harpoon, which is a Lancer specific weapon, I immediately change to the Lancer class, swapping my hotbar with Lancer specific skills. Every class has its own class quests with fully fleshed out stories, and you must complete the early level tutorials for the classes before you can swap over to them. Gaining experience points will also be specific to the class that you're currently using as well. The benefits of leveling a whole bunch of classes is for the cross-class skills which I talked about earlier, and some will be very handy to have. At later levels, you can then specialize in a job by equipping a soul crystal. This grants you more specialized skills based on the chosen job. These jobs will require some progress in 2 classes. For example, for my Lancer to specialize as the Dragoon job, my Lancer needs to be a level 30, while I need to have leveled my Marauder class to level 15. I know it sounds incredibly complex, and I do apologize if my explanation is a little off, but that's the nature of how deep the class, jobs, and profession systems in this game is. I found this to be a really unique system that allows your character to grow in a multitude of ways and become more self-sufficient, and even to fill in roles for dungeons within your group or guild when needed. It gets rid of the need to level up alt characters, so in some way your subscription time isn't really going to waste because you can experience and get the best out of all classes and professions on one character without needing another. Number 7. PVE Progression. Final Fantasy XIV's PVE progression is an incredibly linear experience, whereby you absolutely need to progress the game's main story to unlock important content. On top of that, a lot more features are level gated and will require you to be at that level in order to do a lot of the fun stuff in game. The main storyline quest chain is the ultimate PVE progressor, and you will want to go all the way to the end of the base game's quests to unlock everything along the way. For example, unlocking your first dungeon will be via the main quest at level 15. And acquiring your first chocobo mount will be at level 20. A lot of the content unlocked works this way, and while at the beginning I was put off by it, I can't understand why it was designed this way. It seems to me that Square Enix knows its target audience and caters to a specific type of player. One who enjoys a good narrative-driven experience, may not have played an MMO before, and who has an affinity towards Final Fantasy games. Once I came to understand that, the pacing became better because I was more focused on what the game wanted me to be focused on, like the main stories, the dungeons, and both of these are great ways to gain experience points and level appropriate gear for new players. Oh, and here's what I find really interesting. Even if you are a casual player who hates grouping and dungeons, you don't have a choice but to do them, because some dungeons are tied to the main story and must be completed in order to progress the story. When it comes to character progression, gear is a big part of the equation, and progress is measured in item level, where the higher your overall gear level is, the more effective you are. Getting geared will require you to run dungeons to get the drops for the classes and jobs you play as, and can be crafted as well. Outside of the main stories and dungeons, there are other ways to progress your characters too. There are lots of side quests littered throughout the zones, and it's completely optional to do them for the XP and gear if you want to. For the most part, I just leveled up all the way to 50 via the main story chain, and I found it sufficient on top of keeping up with my class and job quests every 5 levels. For a more spontaneous activity to gain XP, Final Fantasy XIV does have an in-game event system called Fate, and these pop up in almost every region with unique objectives that you can do solo or in a group, and your contribution determines how much XP you gain. And then there's levy quests, which are tied to zone levels and can be done pretty much repeatedly for some XP and gear, but I have to mention the Palace of the Dead, which has become one of my favorite things to do in PvE. It's a retro-themed dungeon crawler that's incredibly fun, where in random or pre-made groups you can progress up the floors and take on bosses, and a few runs will net you a decent amount of experience points. There's a lot of PvE activities within the base game to do, and I haven't even experienced what the expansion has to offer, like anima weapons for gear min-maxers and a whole lot more that I've not come across yet. Number 6. New player friendly. From what I've seen in my month or so on Final Fantasy XIV, the game is incredibly new player friendly. Square Enix has designed the MMO to accommodate non-MMO Final Fantasy players in my opinion, and it's fairly evident in a lot of the design choices within the game. There is a lot of help pop-ups that you can turn off if you wish, and there's plenty of hand-holding as you progress forward in the game. While some of these are optional mechanics such as the mentor-mentee system, others are built into game mechanics such as the chat system where you can join new player chat channels or use auto-translated words in dungeon runs if you're on a foreign server, and a lot more. But as an MMO veteran, the game's incredibly streamlined progression is the most obvious giveaway that Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn was designed to cater towards the huge single-player Final Fantasy audience. If you're not keen on the MMO on-rails theme park experience, then the game could be a hit or miss for you. But for Final Fantasy players who've not played an MMORPG before, then A Realm Reborn and the community definitely takes care of you through the tools and systems in place. Number 5. No in-game store. I fully expected not to see an in-game store of any kind when I started playing Final Fantasy XIV, and I was not disappointed. There's no sign of a cash shop button anywhere in-game from the login screen to the actual in-game UI. It's a clean look and something that any MMO subscribing player can appreciate. A store does exist, but it's a web store and you have to access it outside of the game on your browser. To its credit, the items being sold are strictly cosmetic, ranging from dyes to emotes, mounts, clothing, and housing items. Number 4. The little things. One thing I really appreciate Square Enix doing with Final Fantasy XIV is adding a lot of modern mechanics that enhances the MMO experience. These are MMO designs that you don't see a lot of in other MMOs, and it's these little things that will stick out when I reflect on my time in Final Fantasy XIV beyond just the main story and dungeons. For example, let's start with player commendations. I love this system. When you complete a dungeon, trial, or a raid run, you'll get to award a commendation point to anyone in the group who's given you one for a good performance. It's a great incentive to the honest, hardworking player who do their best in pug runs, and get enough commendations and you can actually get some pretty sweet rewards such as rare mounts. It's a really rewarding feeling as a new player to receive commendations for a job well done, and to a certain extent at least you know the D-bag jerks aren't getting rewarded for being D-bag jerks. And I've already touched on this earlier, but that auto-translated chat words thing is a very cool system to have, especially considering you'll be playing with players from different server locations. It only builds a sense of community, and Final Fantasy XIV would be a really solitary experience without it in my opinion. And finally, there's in-game activities like minigames to break the leveling monotony too. The Manderville Gold Saucer was introduced in patch 2.51, and with it came triple triad card matches, chocobo racing, minion battles, and more. I especially like triple triad. You can play a simple card game with other players or with NPCs, and will collect better cards along the way. It sort of reminds me of the Witcher's Gwent card game that you can play in taverns across the game, but the mechanics aren't as fleshed out. It's still really nice to have, and when you factor in player housing, a mount companion system, levy quests, fates, there's a lot to do in Final Fantasy XIV pre-expansion outside of the PVE store experience for new players. Number 3. Dungeons. Dungeons, trials, and raids are a huge part of the core Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn experience. As mentioned earlier, they are a compulsory experience for all players if you intend to progress your characters through the main story. There are a lot of these in the base game, and from my experience, most of them are very well designed to incorporate the very traditional Holy Trinity party composition. Dungeons in this game that are tied to the main story have really good pacing, interesting boss fights, and mechanics that is a fun challenge for both the experienced MMO player and for newcomers to the genre. It's also a great way to get gear to level up your classes and jobs too. As a new player, getting into one is extremely easy thanks to the Duty Finder tool, and the leveling roulettes are always being done by the player base, so getting into one will be no problem at all. There are queues and wait times for the ever-present DPS role unfortunately, but it won't be too much of a problem if you're in a guild, aka a free company. Within the dungeons, trials, and raids itself, I really enjoyed some of the mechanics available for players to use. Every player will have a set of useful non-combat skills that they can slot on their hotbars, and some of these are target markers which tanks can use to help DPS classes focus fire, which is really handy if the group has newbies in them. That little green leaf on a player's nameplate is how you tell if the player is new. Especially in my case, when I'm playing on the Japanese servers, there isn't a real need to communicate when the community knows how to make use of the tools available to them to help other players out. And then there's limit breaks, which I think is a pretty cool ultimate skill for the party. The meter on the top left of your screen when running dungeons. As you progress, killing trash mobs and monsters, the meter fills up and you can then unleash it, and depending on the player and his role that uses it, the effect is pretty cool. And finally, for the more overzealous instant runners, it will please you to know that there are harder difficulty variations for all the dungeons, trials, and raids in this game, so knock yourselves out. Number 2. A grandiose spectacle. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn is a real treat when it comes to in-game presentation. While the graphics aren't as posh as compared to modern MMORPGs, it still holds up, and you have to look at the presentation as a whole, and beyond just the graphics. Let's start with the cutscenes found in the main story. These are awesome to watch, and it's often a grand spectacle. I remember vividly there was this one particular cutscene fairly early in the game that lasted for nearly 15 minutes. It had everything: a great thematic soundtrack, good voice acting, and a lot of emotion from the characters, and that's a common thread that runs throughout the game. There are 3 variations of story cutscenes in Final Fantasy XIV. The first is when you accept normal quests. You are greeted with an in-game dialogue scene with no voiceover and standard animations. The second is found in important quests within the main story chain or for class quests. The cutscenes in these usually has action scenes and in some cases voiceovers. And the third and final version is the full-blown cinematic spectacles, often lasting a lot longer than the rest with voice acting. Throughout all three, the one thing I really liked is that the NPC characters are never static. You see their facial movements, and while the lip sync is off due to translations, there's so much emotion in their performances that it's easy to buy into the current scenario. But the one thing that makes it all click is the music. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn has an amazing selection of soundtracks from Square Enix composers such as Masayoshi Soken, Nobuo Uematsu, Tsuyoshi Sakido, and Naoshi Mizuta, to name a few. I love how the music blends in seamlessly into the game from the very first moment I stepped into Gridania as a new player, or whenever I level up and get that classic Final Fantasy wind theme. The music just enhances the experience, and for an MMORPG, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn cares deeply about its overall presentation of the game, and you can see the results in its cinematic cutscenes and music. It's pretty close to a single-player Final Fantasy RPG experience, which is a good thing for fans of the franchise. Number 1. The main story. I think it surprises no one that perhaps one of the best reasons to play Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn is for the game's storytelling, and my goodness, it's really good at it. Your entire progress within the game to unlock more content and features relies on progressing the main story. And while that may sound draconian in nature, I don't think players will mind it too much because in my experience, the main story and quest chains have been pretty good. The main story arc in the base game is for the most part well written with a host of likable characters that grows on you over time, but takes nothing away from the fact that you are at the center of the story. It's classic single-player RPG storytelling in an MMO, filled with instant solo quests that sadly you cannot take a friend with you, but that only enhances the immersion in my experience. As for the story itself, I found it quite enjoyable. Without spoiling too much, the game takes place on the world of Hydaelyn in the Eorzea region. There are 3 allied factions in play, which are Gridania, Ul'dah, and Limsa Lominsa, who must band together to push back the threat of the Garlean Empire. Your character will play a prominent role in these events, and at some point will represent one grand company of the 3 allied factions amidst taking part in side plots revolving around your starter region, with a few primals to take down along the way. The story can be light-hearted, then shift to incredibly deep and dark moments, but constantly keeping you invested. And that's down to things that we already talked about, such as the grand cinematic cutscenes, the music, and voice acting. As someone who has not played a whole lot of other Final Fantasy games, knowledge of the lore and characters is not required as a prerequisite to play this MMO. So if you are new, it will be pretty easy to settle in. And of course, the presentation completely elevates the storytelling. The two go hand in hand, and you can begin to understand why the developers puts a lot of emphasis on you, the player, experiencing it above all else in order to fully experience the game. And it is a risk. Loads of MMOs have stories for the sake of having an MMO story. A majority of MMO players look for MMO experiences, the dungeon runs, the gear grinds, the PvP, all while taking part in the social aspects that comes with it. Final Fantasy XIV does the exact opposite, but the fact that people still pay a monthly fee to play the game tells me that it works, not just for the story, but for the rest of what the game offers too. So I do respect Square Enix for sticking to their guns and prioritizing the game's main narrative as the selling point above all other features, and charge a monthly fee on top of that. So, is Final Fantasy XIV worth playing if you've not played it before, and is it worth the monthly subscription? Well, if you're big on MMORPGs that have a great storytelling experience, then it's definitely worth checking out if you've not played it before. There's a free trial in place that you can use to check out the game before you commit to any purchase. I've definitely enjoyed my time on Final Fantasy XIV and have unfinished business. I haven't gotten a chance to check out what PvP's like, and I've been told many times that the expansion, Heavensward, is a must-play due to the big step up in quality all round, from story, quests to gameplay, and for that reasons I will be back one day in the future, so keep an eye out for that. As for things that I did not like about Final Fantasy XIV, yes, there are a few, and a separate video will be out to address that. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to say a big thanks to my sister who sponsored my Final Fantasy XIV game time. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed the content, and do subscribe to the channel for more MMO reviews. I would greatly appreciate your support. Once again, my name is Jerem Adrian, and I thank you for watching.
end of the video you have reached. To subscribe to the dark side, button in the middle you must click. To watch more, left or right you must click. May the force be with you.